Welcome, everyone. We're really happy to have you here this Wednesday afternoon. Our presentation today is about calibrating and leveraging rubrics to measure efficacy of systems and the implementation of teacher professional learning. I'm Lauren Mercier. I work for Demonstrated Success. I come to Demonstrated Success with just under 20 years of experience in the public school system, and I've worked K through 8, have really honed in supporting students' social emotional learning needs as a school counselor and as an administrator to support student behavior. And I'm joined by Jacqueline. Jacqueline, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. Hi, I'm Jacqueline Carabinas. I joined Demonstrated Success just a few months ago, but just like Lauren, around 20 years of experience in education, a wide range of things, primarily, curriculum and instructional design, as well as literacy practices, ed tech integration, and things like that. So thanks for joining us today.
Great. So again, we're from Demonstrated Success, and we partner with the New Hampshire Department of Education to be able to provide these types of workshops for you. And so we're a educational consulting company based off the Seacoast in New Hampshire. We work a lot in New Hampshire and Maine and Massachusetts and Vermont as well. And so you probably have seen us if you've been part of the series here. Of course, you've seen the other webinars, but we have a lot of virtual offerings and a lot of in-person work we do with schools, really supporting data-informed instruction, PLCs. We do a lot with the implementation of the multi-tiered system of support framework, ELA and math curriculum, instruction and assessment, leadership coaching, modeling, culture and climate, a lot of SEL work. And again, leadership cultivation. So we do a lot. So reach out if you need anything beyond this. So just again, some logistics for this meeting. Again, thank you to the New Hampshire Department of Education. This is an interactive session, so we will have some questions for you. We'd love your feedback and your input. So feel free to enter your questions and your comments in the chat, or you could use the Q&A, but I think if we just all use the chat, I think that everybody can see it. So that probably is a little bit easier. Within generally 24 hours, you'll receive an email from us with a link to your professional development certificate and the PowerPoint and any other documents and resources that we might have in that folder for you. And then as you exit today, there will be a brief survey for you, and we would really appreciate your feedback. We design our programming honestly based on feedback, so we take it very seriously and we appreciate it.
So
Great.
we've had, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so we've had a number of sessions here to support the writing of title grants. And so many of you have attended all of them. This is the final one in this series. And all of the recordings are available on our YouTube channel. And we are putting together a toolkit that will highlight all of the tools and tips that we have shared throughout this webinar series. So be on the lookout for that.
Great. So in terms of our objectives for you today, we'll hope that our participants will understand how to leverage rubrics to measure implementation of various things, different systems, teacher learning, etc. Explore a variety of rubrics and their relationship to measurable goals in different funding requests. And we'll talk a little bit about a calibration protocol, and we'll be able to give that to you as a resource for you to use with your teams. Great.
Okay, I know. Kind of funny to start with the pizza, but we're going to. So this is where we're diving right into some group participation. So thank you in advance. So we have this photo of a pizza here, and I'm just going to ask you to take a moment and assess the pizza. Just provide your assessment of the pizza. And if you could throw that in the chat, that would be great. And I know yesterday the chat was disabled. I just checked and it is enabled today. So you should be all set. So go ahead, and Lauren and I will play too. So we'll throw our thoughts in the chat. Anyone else going to share their thoughts? So this is something that's really hard to do because we are presenting you with something with no information. We have no information about, what our goal was for ordering a pizza, or what constitutes a good pizza, what we're all looking for. There are a lot of different things that we need to know if we were to rate this pizza. And even if I said, can you rate this pizza from 1 to 4, there's a number of things you would need to know. What constitutes a 1 versus a 4? What do 1, 2, 3, and 4 stand for? Are there specific, categories that we're looking for? Are there descriptors for each of the criteria? So there's a lot of information that goes into assessing something and trying to get some information. So we know that a lot of things will affect our judgment of something. And so, things like our prior experiences or any background knowledge that we have, if I were a chef, I have a lot more background knowledge about designing a pizza. And so I might have different expectations. My prior experiences, if I don't like pizza at all, then I'm for sure not going to rate it very high because we're not all on the same page. And so just thinking about when we are assessing the efficacy of teacher professional learning, or we're looking at the efficacy of tools, we want to make sure that we are beginning to be on the same page, and rubrics can help us do that. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So you've seen this slide in almost all of the webinars to date, and it really lays out the ingredients of a strong request. And so today we are really looking at the performance measurement. There was a webinar all on constructing SMART goals and lots of webinars about different ways to gather your data. But today we're really going to look at how we can use rubrics to measure the outcomes as stated in our SMART goal. So I just wanted to invite you all to put in the chat, if you are willing to participate today, what your experience is so far of creating or using rubrics to measure intended outcomes, whether you have some that you frequently use on your site, or ones that maybe have been adopted by your school district, ones that have gone with initiatives. So if you have any of those, throw them in the chat. And if not, that's fine too, because we have some examples coming up. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about some of these pieces so far, but the rubrics are assessment tools that are going to provide indicators, criteria, and descriptors of what would be expected at different levels and categories of performance. And so they can help us provide clear expectations, consistent evaluation, feedback, and a more transparent scoring process. Sometimes rubrics can be a little rigid. They can be time consuming to create and use, and they're not appropriate for all types of goals, for sure. And there also are some alternatives. I know that yesterday, a lot of you were in the webinar with Karen Matzo when she presented on perception surveys and the kinds of things the kinds of measurement that those can provide for us. And so rubrics are really helpful, but they're not for everything. So it's important to really think about what the outcome is that we seek and being very clear about how we want to measure that. And just thinking about, yesterday's webinar and perception surveys and rubrics, just thinking about a little comparison between the two, because you can share your own perceptions on a rubric, but the difference between the perception survey is really going to be, do you want to gather the feedback, attitudes, and opinions, or are you evaluating the quality or assessing towards the outcome? So that's really the difference when you're looking at the two of those.
All right, let me just unmute here. Great. So in terms of elements of a strong rubric, we want to consider the criteria. So what categories or a category or categories are really the most important to assess, right? So we really want to think about that and make sure that that is really clear before we, enter into the creation of this document. What are your look fors? So those would be your indicators, and we have some examples for you in just a minute of several look fors within rubrics that that we've created, and others that we've kind of outsourced and brought into the slides. But we'll talk a little bit about how important that part is. The levels of performance. So how will scores be quantified? Will you be on a 1 to 4 scale? Will you be 0, 1, 2? And look whether something is not in place, partially in place, or fully in place. So there's a lot of different things that we can do when we're talking about levels of performance, the different ways we can express that on a rubric. And then, of course, the clarity. So is the language clear? Is the language concise? And is it consistent throughout the rubric, right? So we really want to make sure that that document is consistent from the first level of the rubric all the way up to, let's say it's level 1 to level 4. We want to use consistent language. And then weighting. So we want to consider if the categories hold priority over others, right? And so as the creator of the rubric, and I'm thinking that you're going to be doing this with teams, right? With your team, you'll be able to make some of these decisions and tweak as you go, of course, but these are some really important elements that you want to think about sort of as you're embarking on this process. So this is just an example and of what we were talking about with a look for. So this would be a look for rubric for tier 1 practices. So this was based on like an elementary classroom, and it is a couple of pages long, and we'll actually have a chance to get into it as a group in just a few minutes. But with these tier 1 practices, this was designed for elementary. And these are just a handful of examples of what I might want to see when I walk into a really highly functioning, elementary school classroom with really solid tier 1 approaches and tier 1 practices in place to support students. So you can see that I'm choosing to go with the number 1, no evidence. 2 is some evidence. 3 would be satisfactory. And then 4 would be exemplary evidence when I'm looking and I'm making my observations. So I'm not using this rubric, right, to assess student work. I'm not necessarily using it to, assess the teacher evaluation. I'm going to use this rubric in a situation where, and we'll talk a little bit about the outcomes in a minute, but, teachers have had some professional learning around tier 1 practices. So I'm coming in here using this rubric to look at, student work displayed, for example. How are things organized in the classroom? So this is how I'm going to use this type of rubric. And always in your rubrics, right, we're going to create this space to score, but also a space to record. And it's really important that we add a space to record our impressions, our notes, our comments, because we're going to talk a little bit about calibration in a few minutes. And we're really going to need our findings to help us through that calibration process. So it's really important that whenever you're creating one of these, you make sure that you allow some space for your team, for your observers to note, what they're looking for.
So here's another example of a rubric. It's a lot different from the one that Lauren just showed for the tier 1 practices. This is a rubric that would be assessing the implementation of universal design for learning across a school or in a classrooms. And this rubric this is just a sample of it, just like the one that Lauren showed. It's much longer, and we'll look at the fuller example later. But this one is different because this is more of a developmental rubric. It's progression. So we're looking at, if you look across the top, you can see that we are looking at indicators for emerging, proficient, or progressing toward expert practice with applying UDL principles in the classroom. And so throughout this rubric, they have descriptors for each of the categories that they're looking for. And one way this can be used is to assess growth in teachers. So if you look at, how many teachers you would identify as emerging at the beginning of the year, did they move toward proficient? Or are some teachers remaining around emerging and just need some support to try to move toward proficiency in specific areas of the rubric. And so this is a little bit different because this doesn't have numbers to quantify a score. We're looking at teacher level or growth. And so using a rubric like this, we may need to decide, what percentage of teachers we want at which level, or we would decide how many teachers or what percentage of teachers we wanted to create growth from, say, the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And here's another one. This is another rubric that doesn't have a range of numbers. This is also a really long rubric that has literacy look-fors across a number of categories. And this is the kind of rubric where this would probably need to be broken down into pieces. If your goal was specifically about, this one just showcases the instructional moves portion of the literacy look-for rubric, but there are lots of other categories. And so you could go and pick and choose the specific sections that matched the outcomes that you were hoping with whatever professional learning that your teachers were experiencing. And so a rubric like this, I would say this isn't quite ready to use because there are decisions to be made. We have the exemplar and non-exemplar, and they're very clear, but we would need to decide how we're going to use it. Are we going to put these on a scale of 1 through 4 using the exemplar and non-exemplar as our begin and end of range? Are we going to do an observed, not observed? So it really depends on what it is that you're looking for. And this all comes back to the goals in your request, exactly what you're trying to achieve, and then making sure that your rubric is going to give you that information. And it may mean that you have to tweak rubrics sometimes to match what the information that you seek. So these are all different kinds of things that might be listed in your requests of intended outcomes, things that you want to happen in your school. You want every classroom to showcase research-based literacy practices, or you are looking at teachers using more inquiry-based practices in classroom lesson design. You're trying to do math workshop across the school, PLCs, there's a lot of different things here. And these are all the kinds of things that are observable and tangible and measurable. And the rubrics will support you in doing that. So when you're writing your goals, you should already have an idea of what it is you are going to use to measure so that you are matching the rubric to your intended outcome and measurement. So we'll just take a look at this chart. These are an example of three goals from sample requests. And so just to take a moment to look at these, and one of them doesn't need a rubric. So just take a moment to read and see which one would not require a rubric. Okay, Lauren, you want to guess on this one?
The third one?
Yeah, tell us why you're thinking the third one.
Okay, so I'm thinking about the third one because we're looking at test scores here, and it's not always the best way where we don't need a rubric to look at the gains, in math per se. We'd use our data to tell us that. So we don't need to use a rubric in this scenario.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, at the end of the day, all of the things we want to do in schools we hope will impact performance and achievement, some of which can be shown on test scores, but a lot of it cannot be shown on test scores, or it can't be shown within the timeline of 1 year, especially if you're, creating a lot of school change, overhauling curriculum and practices and things like that. So in these other examples, you can see that there are very specific things named in the goal for measurement. So that first one for PLC teams, I see the phrase evolve to the sustaining level 3. So evolve tells me that we're looking for growth. We're looking for the PLC teams to show growth to level 3 by June 24. And the rubric is named. So they already have a high functioning PLC's rubric. So if you are embarking on this type of goal and you realize you don't have a rubric to measure what you're looking for, you might need to just take a step back and think about that, because the only way you're going to really be able to measure the impact that this goal may or may not have had is to have a rubric that's going to match that. In the the second one, the same thing, inquiry-based practices. For this one, I see the phrase will be evident. So that shows me that they are looking for evidence of these practices. We're not necessarily looking for a growth on the development scale, like the previous one or like the UDL rubric I showed earlier. But we are going to use a school-wide Tier 1 high priority practices rubric. So maybe we name that rubric, maybe we don't have it quite yet. We're naming it in the goal. And so that's something that we're going to need to locate, we're going to need to design, and then eventually calibrate, which we'll get to in a little bit. All right, just pause for questions right now. I know a lot of you have just been listening and enjoying these webinars throughout the series. And so we're glad you're here, but please, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them out for us. Okay.
Thought I heard something, but I guess we didn't. Okay, great. So on your screen, you see an example of a request, and we've used this same format throughout the webinar series, right? So this is familiar to you. So we see an identified priority need or priority area, excuse me. We have an intended outcome. We have a performance measurement, and then an activity or activities that will support that performance measurement and the overall intended outcome. So you can see here that we're talking about, a professional development needs assessment has revealed that teachers need training in using Tier 1 practices, best practices. And so we want the outcome to be that our teachers will implement learn strategies, grades K to 5, because that's our school span, right, in the general classroom setting. So Tier 1, right? We're going to say that our performance measurement at the very end of this will be 95% of teachers will be earning a 3 or better in all indicators of the Tier 1 classroom look-fors by May 2024, just as an example, right? And then to support this, I'm going to choose to have my teachers attend a full day workshop, followed by some one-on-one coaching, maybe by an MTSS coach, right? Or whomever it may be, someone on the Tier 1 team will do some coaching to support the use of this training for best practice. And then grade levels will conduct a book study as well, right? So this is the name of a made-up book because we've used a made-up school, but we're also going to have a book study as well to help us support what we want teachers to learn, right, as an activity for all of our staff. And that will, again, those topics are going to support that priority area and then the general outcome. So I'm going to go back to my rubric, and actually this time, Jacqueline, you can click on the link so everyone can see it. You can just see it a little bit better this way. Good. And maybe zoom in just a little bit if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. So everyone can see. Yeah. And so these are just some topics, right, that I've chosen as really important look-fors for Tier 1, right, if I'm coming into a classroom. If you were looking at this rubric, I'd like to give you a second to look at it, but I'm wondering, what questions would you have if you were just seeing this rubric for the first time?
I'm going to pop the link into the chat in case anyone wants to open it and take a closer look.
I think we we should be good with access on that too. Perfect. So I'll give you just a minute to take a look. So I think if I were looking at this, sort of initially, right, I would think about that scoring from 1 to 4, and I would want to know, what would constitute a 2. I know 1 is no evidence, right? But what is going to constitute a 3, for some evidence, right? What is going to constitute, a 2 for some evidence? What is going to constitute a 3 for satisfactory evidence? And then what makes up a 4? Right? What does that look like? And so, like the first example that is on here, student work, I can very clearly see if there was no evidence, right? But what's exemplary evidence? Is that like student work is wallpapered on all over the classroom? Like what does that look like? And so when we get to this next phase of what we need to do with our rubrics with our team, which is that calibration, it's that understanding of these areas, because we need to make sure we're all on the same page with that. But that would be one question, that I would have if I were to look at this document for the very first time and, needing this document to support that, that outcome, right? So I would need to make sure that I was really clear on something like that, on that scoring piece for sure. Jacqueline, do you want to tackle that next request?
Yeah. So here's another request. We're back in Happy School. And so this is a school that determined that they need to address equity and access to instruction. And so the outcome is that they're looking to implement strategies from UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and SIOP, which is sheltered instruction. I'm spacing on the O for a moment, but placement for students acquiring English. And so we have 2 performance measurements here, which is why I picked this example. I'm going to come back to the performance measurement in a moment, and I just look at the activity. So this is going to be a lot of purchasing PD and purchasing technology. And so we're going to need PD and SIOP, and in UDL, we're going to need co-teacher strategies. There's a lot of things we're going to need PD in. And, purchasing the technology is going to support, it will support both the practices for SIOP and for UDL, but just noting that all of the things we listed in the activity those will all lead us to the outcome. So this performance measurement, we're looking to do 2 measurements because we want to use 2 separate tools. The outcome is similar, but because we're looking at these specific practices, we're going to use a UDL rubric and we're going to use a SIOP rubric. So we'll just take a closer look at those. UDL. Okay, so this one we just took a quick look at earlier. And so if you're familiar with UDL, you understand that it's broken into providing multiple means of engagement, as well as multiple means of representation, and finally, multiple means of action and expression. And so there are very specific UDL guidelines teachers would receive training on. And so, that's another thing that I find to be really important, is that our training should match the rubric, should match our intended outcome. And so, whoever is going to be doing the assessing with the rubric has to, have access to these materials or be a part of the training or be very familiar, have some expertise with this particular subject area. So on this rubric, like I mentioned earlier, it's a progression rubric. So this is where we're going to be looking at moving up on developmental levels, but we'll also be able to do that by each category. And so it could be that you're looking for teachers to move up in the category for all 3 areas, or maybe teachers have determined that they really need to, scroll past that. really need to focus on this one domain, providing multiple means of representation, allowing students to, or providing different ways that we present information for students. And so this is a rubric that we might use the whole thing, we might just use one of the pieces, but again, whatever we use just very clearly has to match our intended outcome. Here's an example of the sheltered instruction observation protocol. And so this one is also split into categories. Now, what's different with this one is we now have from NA all the way through highly evident. And so there are a lot of pieces here. Like Lauren said earlier, if you don't see it, you don't see it. So that makes not evident pretty simple. But I have a lot of questions about this one. When would NA be acceptable? And what are the indicators for the range from 1 to 4? From 0 to 4 of not evident to highly evident. It gives a lot of examples down the left that I think will really be helpful to guide the team in assessing, if we're doing instructional rounds and maybe moving through an instructional rounds protocol in our district. But again, we really want to make sure that we're on the same page with those, because you can see there are a lot of different things that we're looking at, a lot of things that are going to be described, and everyone's going to bring to an observation their own background and their own experiences with this. So looking back at the performance measurement for the UDL instructional rounds protocol, they're looking for everyone to grow by 1 proficiency level. So since we're showing growth, we're going to need to do this rubric twice. We're going to have to do it maybe, at the beginning of the year, mid-fall, and then at the end of the year. And then the same thing using the SIOP protocol, because we're looking for growing by 1 proficiency level. So that was that 0 to 4. So that one's a little bit different. And here's a little piece of that one again. And so we've mentioned a number of times about calibration, but the story we're trying to build here for you is that rubrics are a really helpful tool, and there are a wide range of rubrics with different formats and different ways to measure. They can be really helpful, but there are a lot of nuances in them. And so it's important to really understand all of the pieces of the rubric and how they match your intended outcome, and making sure we write our requests in that way. And so even more importantly, if these rubrics are going to really give us the information that we seek in a consistent way, we want to make sure that we run calibration protocols.
All right, thank you. So calibration is really critical, and it's a step that we don't always take when we're working on teams and we're doing observations. You may have worked through a calibration protocol of some kind, looking at a piece of student work. I feel like that is a common practice, but we're going to ask, you to think about sort of extending that same type of practice as we look at like bigger systems. We've talked a little bit about tiered instruction, tiered system of support, UDL, and using that on the rubric as an indicator. So, we want you to think about this protocol as going beyond just perhaps using it for a piece of student work. So calibration is really critical. Again, it's going to deepen our understanding of our expectations, and we can use it for teacher learning. We can use it for student work, as we've said, and systems in general, right? So it's a universal protocol that we can use, and we can tweak it to fit our needs, right? Based on whatever the situation is that we need it for. It supports that standardization, which is really, really important. And it minimizes the variation in interpretation. So if you think back to the pizza, and so, Jacqueline said there's too much going on in the pizza. I look at the pizza and I say, that looks delicious to me, right? So I want all of those things, and I want them all at the same time, right? So, we have to have a way to sort of create our rubric, calibrate our rubric so that we can determine the best pizza in the world if we're using that example, right? What are the indicators for that? So really that, and I think interpretation, right, has a real big piece in how we fill out our rubrics. And so we want to make sure that we're on the same page with that, right? So just because we have, the same categories, same indicators, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a shared understanding or a shared definition of the different categories that we're working with. So that's really important. Great. So we'll use a protocol to ensure the equity in how each person's contributions and assessments are considered and shared in terms of understanding. Okay. So the purpose of the actual protocol and to go through different steps is really to help create a structure that makes it safe to ask questions and to sort of even, challenge kind of the content and, push one another in a professional way, right? So toward growth, of course, right? And so we often use protocols so that we can sort of take that systematic approach to what we're working on to better improve our systems, right? Protocols also help encourage us to be effective and efficient with our time. Sometimes we can kind of get off on a tangent if we're talking about something that somebody observed in a classroom, for example, right? And feeding in that own personal opinion. Generally in this protocol piece, you have an opportunity to share your feedback, but everything is timed. So, it doesn't allow for us to kind of go into the weeds, if you will, right? It really does require us to stay focused because it's a timed piece. And we'll talk a little bit about, the different time variations when we get to that piece. Good. So these are the major sort of components, and I'm going to break the process down, and we're actually going to open up the document in a second, but we have a planning and preparation. We put 30 to 60 minutes here, and that was done intentionally because if you're doing an actual observation and then coming back as a team, then it's going to take you longer. If you've already observed and you're going to go through a protocol, then, you're going to move a little bit faster. So we just wanted you to know that there's a range for that. Jacqueline, if you want to open up this document, I think that would be helpful. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So again, we're going to have, a varied time piece on there. Obviously you want to make sure you have your rubric for everybody. That's the number one material that really is needed, and your team members, of course. You want to make sure that you have your SMART goal, right? Everybody is in the know with your SMART goal. Everybody understands what the desired intended outcome is. And the other thing that you need, which is noted actually on the line below, but the other thing that you need is a facilitator. And so the facilitator can come from one of your team members, but you want to make sure that you note somebody who's going to be in charge of the clock, right? And in charge of moving dialogue along as you go through, right? Making sure you're hitting all of the steps of that protocol. That would be what that facilitator, would be there for, in addition to kind of moving the dialogue along if you get stuck. Okay, so one of the team members, and that's a position that rotates depending upon how many times you're going to do an exercise like this. It doesn't have to always be the same person, right? So in terms of your process, you are going to share this protocol with your team members, and you're going to talk about each step of the protocol. And you will then, have give your folks an opportunity to read through the document, the protocol document. Again, come back to the goal. Make sure your folks have the goal in front of them, all the intended outcomes, and the rubric as well. So this is all part of the beginning phase. Clarifying questions really is an opportunity for people to ask questions about material and process. We're not asking questions about what we may have seen. So if you've already observed, right? If you've already observed and you're coming to a protocol, we're not using this portion to do what you've already seen. It's only to clarify pretty much the expectations of you as a participant and a team member in this process. Okay. So the stars are here. The line is here to sort of differentiate and to say, this is where we may break up into two-part process, two-part protocol, right? So the first, you may gather your team together, you may break, and then you may go off and do the actual observations. So you've gathered your team, everyone's on the same page, then we move to actually go do our observations. So in this part, right, we are observing and we're scoring based on the rubric that you have, okay? While you're scoring, this is where in the earlier slide, we said you always want to be keeping notes, right? So we're noting what we see, certain words, phrases, anything that is going to really help to best describe your observation is what you want to capture on that document, on that rubric, okay? And, you want to be able to justify your scores, because part of what we're going to do next is coming back together as a team to talk about sort of those individual, that individual scoring. So after you've done that observation, we're going to come back. Step number 5 is the score sharing and discussion. And so, one at a time, what basically happens is we're going to go around and each team member is going to share their score without an explanation, right? We're not going to dig into any of the because at this point. We're just going to simply say, I rated it a 3, right? And we're going to leave it there. And so the facilitator, again, we're going to move through this process and is really going to invite the group to consider, where the differences are occurring. So this is where we're going to start to see, I scored a 3, Jacqueline gave something a 1, and we're going to start to get into, that justification or that explanation. Well, it's because I saw this, right? And Jacqueline saw something different, perhaps. So this is where this discussion piece is really where we're going to sort of come to consensus, and we're going to be able to define those different areas of that rubric. And then this is also an opportunity where you, during this phase, where you are going to ask some clarifying questions to resolve any issues centered on either like the meaning of the rubric. So those are the indicators or the values, or the merit and the validity of the evidence that you observed, right? And so we really do want to work to consensus during this process. And then finally, we're going to have an opportunity to actually debrief. And so we can follow these questions as we debrief. So, of course, what did we notice about scoring and using the rubric? What would be our next steps? What changes do we need to make, perhaps, right? What revisions to the rubric need to be made? And then what implications do our findings have, right? And so we move through this process. And when we do this process consistently, our teams get to, I think, come to be familiar with a protocol such as this. And, it feels like a lot of steps, and it feels like it might take a really long time. But once this becomes, again, common practice, people really will move efficiently through this practice. And it does, like we said before, it really does help to eliminate personal feelings about what you see or what's missing, perhaps. And it helps us stick to facts to make improvements.
I just want to add, Lauren, that, you were saying stick to facts. That was something that was in my mind too. It's something, when we're observing data, we do the same thing at first, right? We name, exactly what we see. And, I think that some rubrics might, if you're doing instructional rounds or you have a certain type of rubric that's really lengthy, that may require you to do it in a couple of phases. You may need to only note observations and evidence, and then you may need to go sit and score after that, so that you're not focused so much on the scoring, while you're trying to note evidence. I think that, depending on the type of rubric or the type of observation that you are doing, that could also be something that needs to fit into that time frame. Okay. All right, so we're going to look at an example with some data along with it. So after all of these webinars, you're probably sick of seeing these now, but here we are, another description of a priority and outcome, performance measurement, and activity. And so in this one in particular, they're using the funds to purchase PLCs at work for teachers to study together. They're going to get a professional development coach to support setting up their PLC systems. And so they're looking to really build an effective high-functioning PLC teams in their building. And so we can see that there's a specific rubric, but they're using a PLC self-assessment rubric. So they're going to be assessing. I'll just go right to the rubric, I think. So this is just a snapshot. This isn't the full rubric, but again, I can pop into that. They're going to be assessing themselves in a number of topics, and then also looking at this range of 1 to 4, defined from beginning to sustaining. And so, as I'm just going to go back to the goal here, we're looking for every grade level PLC will be at a 2 developing or above, according to their self-assessment rubric. Now, when I look at the beginning, it says from fall 2023 to spring 2024. That shows me that since we're beginning this initiative, we really want a baseline because we want to see that we are making progress. So even though it doesn't specifically name growth, we want everyone at a 2, but we do need a baseline to help us with this. So here's a sample set of data from this. And so we can see there's 2 tables here. They're both grade 3. Because remember, for our goal, we're looking at grade level teams specifically. So we would need to do this with each grade level. But this one shows grade 3. And so they self-assessed through the rubric in November. And so all of those scores are noted here, along with the average for each of the categories. And you couldn't see all of those in the previous one because it was just a screenshot, but that team norms, learning, data-driven, all of those things were down the left. And then across the top were the 1 through 4. And so this is where we can see the average across the team, because we are looking at teams to be at a 2. And so this gives us an idea of where we need support. It gives us an idea of where we need support as a team, but it also, gives us an idea of who needs support on an individual level. And that can be really helpful, especially if you have coaches working with the teams. Then the coaches can more clearly see the kinds of things that might need to be modeled or, really focus on in their coaching sessions together. And then if I look at May, I can look at the growth if I want to, but really I'm thinking of the goal. The goal was that grade levels would be at a 2. And so looking across all of these categories, I see that we have met that goal. But there are a couple of things that I'm wondering about with this data. I have a lot of questions. I'm just wondering, did they do calibration before starting this protocol? And, if not, how did that impact their baseline scores? So I'll just give you a moment to look at the first table and just share anything that you notice or anything that you notice about the first table of November 2022. And I know we have a quiet group today, which is totally fine. So Lauren, I may call on you again.
So I notice that under the team culture, I noticed that Mike has assessed that at a 1, but is it Ezra? I'm following the line, has assessed it at a 3.5. So that's a big discrepancy. So I might question that. I would say, oh, wow, that would be one thing that I would note.
Yeah, I'm looking at that same column and I even see some 4s.
4.
And
yep.
a 1.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it makes it's interesting because if you look at goals is pretty similar across the board. Everyone did a 1 except for Ezra with the 1.5. but it makes me, it gives me pause, and it makes me ask a lot of questions. Does it have to do, if we already did calibration, let's say we did calibration, are there some biases creeping in? Are there some, preferences creeping in? Especially thinking about team culture, that could have a lot to do with how individuals are seeing themselves as part of the whole, or even understanding what exactly creates a high functioning team. So lots of things that you can look for, but let's say that they didn't do a calibration, then we can easily see the pieces that we have to discuss. So going back to the calibration protocol, Lauren mentioned it feels like a lot of steps and it feels like it takes a long time. But you can see here, not everything is going to be, up for a hot debate. So here, there are some that are very clear, that won't need a lot of discussion. People are on the same page. And then there are some that need you to take a closer look. And this could be for a variety of reasons. But we just wanted to show this example. And again, all rubrics are so different that what you're looking at for calibration is going to be different. But you can really look for places where, for places where everyone seems to be on the same page, and places where it's very clear that you need to do a little bit more digging to figure out exactly what lens people are looking through. So really, when you're getting started with the calibration protocol, the first thing is assemble your team or your teams. You may have teams already in place in your school, or that may be something new to you. And so you want to make sure that you gather people together that have expertise or experience in the areas that will be observed, and especially those that have had similar access to the tools. So if I'm if I'm going to be observing for implementation of universal design for learning, I have to have some significant knowledge of that to really understand what I'm looking for. The rubric is going to tell me a lot. It's going to give me examples, and the protocol is going to help us all get on the same page. But I still need to have an understanding of what universal design for learning is, and what its intentions are, so that I understand what I'm looking for. And then really making sure that you plan for how you're going to use the information. This is always sometimes the tricky point with data, is we collect a lot of data in our schools and we don't always do something with it. Not that we don't want to, but sometimes we haven't decided what we will do with it, or as part of the plan created the space and time to have that to make those decisions about what we'll do with the data. And that might be a good thing to think of at the time of request. You don't have to put that in your request, but when you name the goal, and SMART goals are timely, so you name that time period, you may want to take that opportunity right then and there to schedule something in the future to when you're looking at the data, but also to decide what you're going to do with it. Is it going to determine what professional development you're going to get for the summer or for the following year? Is it going to determine if you'll continue coaching? All kinds of things that you might need to look at and talk about as a team. So whenever you get the email that is a follow-up from our webinar today, you're going to get a lot of resources. All the rubric examples that we've talked through are going to be in the folder. We also linked for you the playlist on our YouTube channel that has all of the title webinars. And we also wanted to share, to support your grant requests, that you all have access to EBSCO through the Department of Education, so that you can use that when you're finding the research to support your requests. So a really great tool that you can have access to. And again, the folder will have lots of examples, things that you may be able to use. Some might be familiar to you, some might be new, and that will at least get you started with some rubrics that might support you. So thanks for joining us today. Lauren and I enjoyed being here with you, and we will see you very soon.